All right, so let's get started. My name is Chris Black. I'm a manager with LendingTree's Talent Acquisition Department. I started in 2011, September this year. I will have been with the company 9 years. This really came about 2 or so months ago when we were looking for a way for us to be able to give back to the community. And we really decided on 3 things, and this webinar is one of them. So we're going to do 2 webinars, one today, one in 2 weeks. The one today, of course, is how to build a great resume. The one in 2 weeks is how to get interviews, how to conduct interviews, up to including how to negotiate a great salary. The other is an AMA, an Ask Me Anything, through the month of June. At the end of this webinar, we're going to send you a link so you can ask us any question that you want. But in addition to that, I'm hoping you'll ask questions during the webinar. If you'll notice at the top or bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Please do use that through the webinar. Now, because of the format, I won't be able to answer the questions during the webinar, but at the end, absolutely, I will be able to answer them. Now, let's get some legalese out of the way to make our legal departments happy. All information is based on our opinions. It is intended solely to provide generally applicable information and should not be understood as a guarantee or assurance of future success in any manner. Let's get started. So let's start with why a resume is so important. We'll talk a little bit about what a resume is and really what a resume is not. One thing it is not is a silver bullet. I don't care how good your resume looks. I don't care how good your background is. It's not going to automatically get you a job. What it is, hopefully, is a step towards the next step in the process. Obviously, there's many steps in the process before you actually accept a position with a company. This is one of those steps. Now, it is usually the first step. So it is very, very critical that you have the best resume possible. A lot of the things that we're going to talk about today will require some effort to create a great resume. And based on math that I've done in the past, based on colleagues that I've talked with, it really does translate to the time you put into it, hundreds, if not thousands of dollars per hour that you can get from putting the effort into having a great resume. It really is the first impression. We know how critical first impressions are, but more often than not, a recruiter, hiring manager, members of the team that you might be on, their first impression of you is reading your resume. So you want to be as professional as possible. You want to show the level of professionalism that you have. And the fact is that you take your career seriously and you want that to come across. Now, how it can translate in as far as financially is that you absolutely could get more money. We're going to be showing a gauge here in a second that kind of illustrates the process, the interview process, and how things may change during the interview process. But you want the individuals to be as sold on you as possible from the get-go. Every position out there, just about every position, has a salary range, and obviously you want to be on the top end of that range when they finally do make you an offer. And the fact of the matter is that the longer you go without a position, the longer you're unemployed, that's lost income you're not getting back. And just for as an example, let's say you're making $50,000 a year. That translates to $3,000 net per month, roughly. That's gone, that you no longer can get. I've spent many years working with different career ministries in the Charlotte area. I've helped hundreds of people at this time find positions, and I've seen it where individuals, sometimes it's only a month or two that they're out of work, but I've seen individuals go 9 months, 12, 18 months, and it really can be a difficult time. So the sooner you get a job, absolutely the better. And also, I would say this last point is really the most important one, is that you want to be in control. You want to pick the company that you really want to work for. You really want to do the type of work that you really want to do. You don't want to put yourself at a point of desperation where you're just picking something because it happens to be available. This is the gauge that I was talking about. And a great resume is going to put you in a position of being desired by the company. Now, there might be one or two mistakes that you might make during the interview process. There might be one or two things you do great during the interview process. It's going to move that dial one way or the other. But the more that you can start to the far right, the better you're going to be throughout the entire process. Let's look at some numbers. The first two are really very closely related. We're now down to 6 seconds. It seems like every year it gets a little bit lower. 6 seconds, the average amount of time a resume is reviewed. It's really an initial review before a recruiter decides what they're going to do. Are they going to keep reading, or are they going to delete the resume? And because of that, it's critical that your resume is easy to scan. That's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, is how quickly can somebody figure out what you've done, and in the most professional way possible. So 6 seconds is important. And that recruiter for that position is very often looking at 250 or more other applicants. So they're looking at your resume, they're making a decision very quickly, more often than not knowing that they have dozens, if not hundreds of other applicants to consider, very closely related. And a big part of how the recruiting industry has changed, especially over the past 8-10 years, has been with scanning software. At this point, and it's according to CNBC, 75% of resumes are never even read by a human because of scanning software. And more companies are using RPO, recruiting process outsourcing. What they're doing is they're having companies, typically overseas, scan resumes for them. That's why keywords now have become so critical in the recruiting process, and especially for candidates that are looking for a job. That's why we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. Let's talk about some of the basic rules of writing a resume. One is definitely use Microsoft Word or Google Docs. A lot of people use a PDF file, and some of those PDF files aren't easily read by a scanner. So if you have scanning software as a company, it may not pick up your keywords in your resume, and therefore you never even looked at for the position. And there's a couple other reasons. One, and this is especially on the contingency recruiting side. So contingency recruiter working at a recruiting company, before they pass your information along to a company, they may redact some of the contact information, depending on their relationship with that company. The reason being is that if they don't trust the company, they may be afraid the company would go around their back and hire you directly without paying them a fee. So they take out your name, number, and email address. If they have to go back and forth with you because you have a PDF document, they might not want to jump through those hoops. And also, and we see this more on the retained search side, they may want to improve your resume, and they might want to go in there and edit some things that you talk to the recruiter about over the phone. They can very easily do that in a Microsoft Word or Google Doc. Also, make sure that just from the first view of your resume that it's visually appealing. And this is something that often recruiters don't even think about. It's subconscious whether a resume looks good to them or not, but it goes back to that first impression. And so make sure it's visually appealing. I'm going to show you two examples here in a few minutes, one that's a good example and one that's a bad example. You want it to be clean and professional, and that's why you don't want to have different color fonts. You don't want to have a lot of different size fonts, different types of fonts. You want to keep things very similar. I would say limit it to 2 or 3 sizes at the most. Obviously, things like your name should be a little bit bigger than some of the other things. Keep in mind also that you want to put yourself in the shoes of the employer. A lot of times we see individuals, especially those that are coming out of school, they'll put things at the very top of their resume. For example, looking for a chance to grow, looking for a chance to learn. And now, while those things are a great positive byproduct of a great experience of working with a company, that's not what the hiring manager is mostly concerned about. They're mostly concerned about what the objectives they have to meet. So definitely keep that in mind as you're creating your resume. And also, back to my point about a resume being very clean, very easy to read. You do not have to use complete sentences. Phrases, and short phrases of that, are usually the best way to go. For that reason, you should never use I on a resume. It's kind of a long-standing rule. Let's talk about keywords. Keywords, as I mentioned, are absolutely critical in this day and age. The best way to know what keywords to include on your resume are to look through a bunch of job descriptions for positions that you're interested in. You're going to see some common themes regarding responsibility, regarding software, regarding industries. All those things should be included on your resume. And not only that, but they should be included in different terms. For example, if you have database experience and that happens to be field you're interested in, you're going to see that on a lot of job descriptions. You very well may have a company who made a mistake, and they, in their keyword limiter, they put in databases instead of just database. You may have just database on your resume. Well, that means you're never even going to get through for a recruiter to see you. So look for, maybe it's in one position you put database, another position you put databases. In the skills section, maybe you put database, and you mix it up a little bit so different versions are in different parts of your resume. And as mentioned before, many applicant tracking systems are now using this automatic scanning software. But even for those that are not, companies like LendingTree, we do not use automatic scanning software. And just to let you know, companies that do, this software will scan for keywords, and then it'll sort the resumes according to the ones that they think are most important, and those are the ones that they're going to present to the recruiter. I highly recommend that you go to a website. I would jot this down, take a picture of the screen. It's jobscan.co. And what they allow you to do for free is to put in your resume and put in a job description. And you can use many different job descriptions, and it'll give you a score of how well your resume matches up to each of those job descriptions. It's free, easy to use, and really can help you identify where on your resume you're lacking some of those keywords. In addition, a lot of people have thought that including keywords on their cover letter would kind of help them in the process. It doesn't. These scanners will only look at the resumes. They don't look at the cover letters. Let's have a little conversation about cover letters. So I'm kind of indifferent when it comes to cover letters. If there's a reason for it, a cover letter, for example, to explain away possibly a break in employment. For example, COVID-19, a lot of people have lost their jobs. There's nothing wrong with mentioning it on the resume. I'm going to talk about that later, but also you may put it into a cover letter. What I recommend is keeping any kind of cover letter very short, and not just reiterating things that are in your resume. Maybe you could talk a little bit about why you're interested in the company. But if something's long, if you're looking at 3 paragraphs long, let's say, it's less likely to be read. So do keep that in mind. Here's an example of a resume that is not visually appealing. It is just a bunch of words. So recruiter, hiring manager from the get-go is just looking at all this text, all these blocks of text. They don't know where to start. They don't know what's important. They don't know what's not important. And I can tell you, just as somebody that looks at a lot of resumes, this is not something I really want to dive into. So if you think back to that gauge that I had earlier, immediately this is going to be in that middle area, even going to the far left, because there's a little bit of frustration with where to deal with this, with how to deal with this resume. So I highly recommend that you have something more along the lines of this, something that's a lot cleaner, it's a lot easier to read. You can clearly see not only their contact information, but you can see their last position, how long they were there. I think everyone can agree this is just a lot easier to read. There's one thing to pay attention to when you're creating a resume is white space. If in the previous examples, we look back here a second, there's not that much white space, just a whole bunch of text. Here we have more white space. It's a lot easier to read, a lot easier to understand. Something very important because it's part of that whole first impression that someone's going to have of you. Let's look at the top section. Part of what I'm going to do is just break this down. Top section, middle section, which is the experience section, and the bottom section of a resume. And by the way, all the names, addresses, contact information have totally been changed. Jason Tarver is actually a friend of mine from Dallas. Feel free to reach out to him, tell him I said hello. This is a good format, especially for someone that graduated college not that long ago. Education for someone that is 1 to 2 years out of school should be at the top. It's kind of a rule of thumb, but I will say I'm now seeing it more and more at the top, even for people that have 8, 9, 10, 15 years of experience. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Could be at the top, could be at the bottom. I personally don't have a preference. One of the things that this person did, again, I'm just a huge believer in when it comes to resumes, less is more. So if you can say something in 5 words instead of 8, say it in 5. This person under their education has GPA 3.65, which is good, and it should be, especially since they're just 2 years out of school or a year out of school. It should be listed. But Dean's List honorees, like obviously you're on the Dean's List at some point if you have a GPA of 3.65. A general rule of thumb of whether you should include a GPA or not is 3.0. I think that's fair. A lot of people, once they get 2-3 years out of school, they take the GPA off, finding that to be typical. This next section is part of the top section, your skills. This can be a great place to include some of those keywords that I mentioned before, and some of the different versions of the keywords that I mentioned before. You don't want to oversell yourself. And really, I'll mention this also, the skills section has kind of replaced the summary, mostly because recruiters are taking 6 seconds to look at a resume. They don't want to read a whole summary section. They just want to quickly scan. And skills are a great way to do that. And there's things I like about what they've listed here. There's a couple things that I would change. One thing you don't want to do is oversell yourself. And maybe this person is really good at valuation and maybe really good at Lean Six Sigma with less than 1 year of experience, but maybe not. Also, they listed Microsoft Office at the top with a focus on Excel, which is good. But if he in fact has done some valuation and he has on the right side financial modeling, then likely he's used some advanced formulas within Excel. Likely he's used macros and VLOOKUPs, pivot tables. He should list that. He should put, experience with Excel, and list some of the things that he's done within Excel. Because what we found is that just about everybody thinks that they're really good in Excel, and until you really start peeling back the layers and using some of the advanced formulas, you're really not. So it can be one of those things that is highly objective when somebody says that they're good with Excel. Let's go on to the experience section. So this is really the heart of the resume. This is where any recruiter, any hiring manager is going to spend the most time. And for that reason, you really want it to be clean and easy to read. There's different formats. I think most of them are okay. Personally, I believe this one is the best. So you have your title, and there's nothing wrong with putting laid off due to COVID-19 parenthetically after your title, or even after your start and end date. I believe the best way to list a start and end date is to start month and year, and then the end date month and year, or put present, or PRES. And then under the title, you want to put the company name and location. And then under that, you want to have a very brief description of the company and a very brief description of what you did. Literally just 2 or 3 lines. And here's a place where you want to start quantifying. And the reason is that if the person reading your resume has never heard of your company, they likely don't have a good understanding of really what it is you've done. So let's take the example of an accounts payable manager at a $20 million company compared to the accounts payable manager at a $20 billion company. Those are vastly different roles. And in some ways, the position, the lower sales position can be more beneficial because they're more responsible for more things, where the $20 billion company, they're more likely delegating, more likely managing more on a day-to-day basis. One isn't necessarily better than the other, but helps the reader to truly understand what that person did when they quantify the company, they quantify the number of people on their team, and most importantly, for this next section, when they're listing their accomplishments. So the first 2, 3 lines is a brief description of the company, brief description of your role. The bullet points are for the accomplishments, and they absolutely should be quantified whenever possible. Sometimes you just can't, but you want to quantify how you made the company money, how you saved the company money, how you improved the processing, and what that resulted in. These are the types of things that truly matter to any type of hiring manager. One of the things that's important, I'm going to show you a heat map on this next slide, but as you're listing those bullet points, the first word of each bullet point should be an active verb, like create, like develop, like manage. It should not be a soft verb, like worked on, or contributed to, aided in. And those things could mean absolutely anything. Helped with, like that could be, you got the coffee. Like, it's so hard to know what that really meant. So you want to use impactful verbs in the first word of each bullet point, and you want to quantify. And when you're quantifying, you want to use actual numbers, that you're putting the number there. And not only does that, again, help define what it is that you did, but it helps the reader understand a little bit better about what your role involved. And also, it's proven that people's eyes are drawn to numbers on the page, and you want those eyes to stay on your resume as long as possible. That's a heat map. So they have software out there that will read someone's eyes as they're looking at a sheet of paper or at a website. This is bullet points. And so, as you can see, especially in the bottom half of this page here, that the eyes are drawn to, first of all, the very top bullet point. So that should be your most impactful bullet point. And then they're drawn to the first word of each of those bullet points listed below. So very, very important that you have those impactful words. One of the things that I've read, one of the heat maps that I've seen, actually shows that if you have 4 or more bullet points, your first one, again, more likely to be read, followed by the second one. But then, interestingly enough, the last bullet point is then the next one more likely to be read. Keep that in mind as you create your resume. Let's talk about a good layout as far as experience. Again, this is the heart of your resume. This is where the recruiter, the hiring manager, the potential members of your team, this is where they're going to spend most of the time looking at what you've done. And this is easy to read. One of the things that this person did not do is they did not, under the name of the company, list their responsibilities. They more put that underneath the bullet point, and I think that was a mistake on their part. They also didn't quantify as much as they should have. Now, to be fair, this person just got the job in January, and they haven't been there that long. Those are some things that I would definitely recommend. They also kind of went. They explained a little bit too much about the company and who they are, kind of bragging that the firm's principals have 40 years of cumulative experience. Is really not as critical to the person reading it as, for example, AMU, assets under management. That would be much more important to a person reading that piece, or how many employees they had, even how many principals they had. Much more important than what that person listed. Again, so much of this has to do with putting yourself in the shoes of the person that's reading your resume. Let's go on to the bottom section. And so this is another area that's sometimes overlooked. Often people just throw their education at the bottom and leave it at that. More and more people are including this additional training, additional information, additional interest section, which I think really does add value to a resume. But let's start at the top. I fully agree with labeling a section. Some people have said that you don't need to label sections because it's understood. But again, if someone, for example, a recruiter, is so used to reading resumes, they're so used to seeing things labeled as experience, or used to seeing things labeled as education, that subconsciously is what they're looking for. So let's make them happy. Let's put it on the resume. So you have a BS in economics in this case, with the date listed. There's some people that have many years of experience, and they think that listing the date of their education could be a detriment to their employment. We're finding that to be less and less the case, but I would say if it's something you're worried about, leave it off. I don't see companies in this day and age holding it against somebody by not having the date on their resume. Listed where they went to school and where the school is located. It's very common, very easy to read. You understand where they stand. One thing I would be careful of, and we have seen this many times over the years, is that people who did not graduate will imply that they did. It's a huge mistake, because the assumption is if you're lying on your resume or you're lying anywhere else during the process, you're probably going to lie when you're an employee. And so it's almost a line in the sand. This person's not going to move forward. So be very, very careful with that. Let's talk about this additional training. And I put 3 different things there. People label it different things. I would look at different resume examples and see which one you may be comfortable with. But the types of things that would go in here would be Coursera or Lynda classes that you've taken. It could be hobbies that you have, volunteer work. You may, if you didn't include a skills section at the top, you may include a skills section here. Again, chance to plug in some keywords, which is so critical. But this is a great section, I think, to show you're a well-rounded person. Certainly not going to deduct points for someone that doesn't have this section. Every once in a while, I'll hear somebody that says, "Yeah, we don't like people to put that stuff on there." I think that's a mistake. Let's talk about some examples on the bottom. So here's a real life example. They decided to call it additional. Just leave it at that, which is certainly fine. They have their language skills there. And I think regardless of the position you're applying to, if you know a second language, you should include it. For one, you never know what the needs of the company may be. I can tell you here in the Charlotte area, there's a lot of German companies. And that's one of the things that they often look for, even though it's not advertised in their job descriptions. And also, I would make the case that someone who has learned a language or two, or in this case, I think it says 3 or 4 languages listed, assuming they know English, that's someone that's pretty sharp. They're probably good at learning things quickly, and it's a good indicator of their caliber. Technical skills. This is a good place to list technical skills as well. And this person has listed Microsoft Suite application, which is fine, Bloomberg Terminal. And I would say this, that for things that are critical to job descriptions that you're looking at, here's another place that you want to make sure that you have the software listed, because they're going to need to see that in order to move you forward in the process. And then this person, they listed some of the hobbies that they have. It's rare, but I will say some people over the years I've seen, they've listed some interesting hobbies. And so I just use a little common sense is what I'd say to that. Let's look at another example here for the bottom section of a resume. This one is a little bit more robust, a little bit more to it. Again, we have a skills section where they have their technical abilities listed. They have under other, they have Spanish listed. And I think it's good. Sometimes people will just list languages and then they'll list a bunch of languages. I think it's good to qualify how well they know that language. So if you know something, a language, and you're conversational or you're basic or you're fluent, it's good to list that in there. You don't want to oversell or undersell yourself in that situation. Projects is good. I'm guessing these are side projects this person is working on, although they should have listed that if that was the case. But it's good if you're working on side projects. Just about any company out there is going to view that as a positive, that you're entrepreneurial, that you're learning things outside of work through these side projects. So it's a huge plus that if you have that experience, that you should put on your resume. And then they have other activities, which seem in this case to be some volunteer activities. One thing I'll say is that if your volunteer work is outdated, let's say in this case he worked with a teen mentor, I'm not sure what that is. Let's say they did that back 5 years ago, and it comes out during the interview process that thing's 5 years old. He hasn't done anything since. It's a little misleading. So I would be a little bit careful with that. But if it's recent, absolutely. I've also seen people that have listed dates that they've done their volunteer work, next to each of the things that they've done. And that's great. Very often it's a particular year up until present. It's great. It's easy to understand. I would definitely recommend this. Now, this person has listed a number of their social media sites, and I only recognize 3. And so I'm not even sure what they all are. But I will say this, that I see Instagram on there, if you have an Instagram site that's for professional reasons, we more often see this on the creative side, then absolutely include that on your resume. But just including your professional Instagram on your resume, big mistake. Don't do it. The other thing that I'll say is that, along those same lines, if you're in the technology field and you have a repository, I would definitely include a link to that repository. Now, this person just included the icons, which I think is a mistake. Call me a little bit old school. But this resume, if a person goes through the interview process, is going to be emailed around. It's at least possible that the links somewhere along the line are going to be broken. Whereas if they had actually typed out the actual link, at a minimum, the person could copy and paste that into their browser and get to those links very, very quickly. So that's one thing I would definitely recommend changing. So some additional suggestions, and I've seen this over the years. People sometimes are afraid of coming across as a braggart, and so they end up being very modest in what they put on their resume. Huge mistake. Nobody is going to pound your drum louder than you. The person reading your resume is not going to infer things. They absolutely need to hear from you your accomplishments. You should be proud of those accomplishments. Obviously, you don't want to cross the line to the point where you're exaggerating, but this is not the time to be modest. And also, when you get done creating a great resume, you will have looked at that thing dozens, maybe hundreds of times, and you'd probably convince yourself that there's no mistakes. Almost always there is, because you've looked at it dozens and hundreds of times, and that's why you end up missing it. And so have at least 2 or 3 people look at that resume. My recommendation is to send it to one person, get it back, and send it to another, just to make sure you're covering your bases. Because when there is a mistake on a resume, and some hiring managers are more stringent than others, people view that as this person is not detail oriented. I can tell you that I worked with a manager of a software QA department in the past, and that manager had a line in the sand rule that if there was a mistake on the resume, they could not be somebody that they would work with. And so it can be detrimental, to say the least, if you have mistakes on your resume. You should definitely take that seriously. And lastly, your resume really needs to match your LinkedIn profile. I'm shocked by the number of times that dates, and sometimes not just the month, sometimes the entire years don't match up. And sometimes the titles are off a little bit. Now things, if it's something that isn't material, has to be a little bit different, happens to be a little bit different, I don't see that as a huge issue. But if someone is off by, a year, several months even, there's something going on. It could be they're misleading, trying to be misleading, or it could be they're just not detail oriented. In any event, it's worth spending time matching your LinkedIn profile to your resume. Here are some references to things that I put up. And now, we're starting with the Q&A section. So, first question is, how many pages should a resume be? For years and years, there's kind of a hard, fast rule: do not have your resume be more than 2 pages. That's when people printed out a resume and actually had physical paper. And it happens sometimes, but it's not the norm. So as a general rule, I would say if you're coming out of college, usually you don't have enough experience to warrant more than a 1-page resume. I would say don't cram it all into 1 page. If maybe you've had a number of internships, and maybe you've done a number of things, and you justify going to, say, a page and a half. It's absolutely fine. What I wouldn't do is try to cram everything into 1 page so that it's not visually appealing. Now, say you have many years of experience, I still say that maybe 3 pages would be good. Putting bullet points next to each one about what you've accomplished. I've seen some that literally are 8-9 pages long, and at a certain point, the person's just repeating things over and over. It's exhausting. So my rule of thumb, between 1 and 3 pages, depending on how much experience you have. Should I include jobs that I have had done that don't relate to the job I'm seeking? I would. And I just because otherwise you're breaking your resume apart maybe in sections, or you have gaps in your resume if you're not including certain positions. I think it's a mistake. And I'll say this, that someone who has different types of experience, that's not necessarily a bad candidate. Like, they're just happen to be more well-rounded. So absolutely, I would list the different positions, and that it's going to be obvious to the person reading it what's relevant and what's not. How important is the summary section? So the summary section, and kind of the rule of thumb is a summary or an objective section should be used in 1 or 2 cases. One would be coming right out of college, an objective summary might be good to show that you're really interested in a particular area. It's not just, you're not applying to this position just willy-nilly because you want a job. I have an interest in this particular area, and you're pointing that out. The other time is when you're switching positions. So let's say you've been a registered nurse for 6 years. You went to college to be a registered nurse. You're looking for your next position to be a registered nurse. There's no reason to have an objective or summary section in that case. But if you're wholesale switching industries, switching positions, switching careers, then yes, it's worth pointing out, this is now what I'm interested in doing. As far as a summary of your qualifications, really the skills section has replaced that now, because the point I made a little while ago is that 6 seconds are being spent on a resume. Recruiters don't want to spend time reading a summary section. They're much more likely to scan a skills section. And so the skills section has really replaced the normal summary section that was popular 10, 15 years ago. What are some of the most common mistakes that people make when writing their resume? I would say is they don't take the time to make it easy to read. It can be, I mentioned, an example, if you could say something in 5 words instead of 8, say it in 5. That can be more difficult than saying it in 8 or 9 words. And so writing short, concise statements takes effort. It takes work. And so putting the effort into doing that, and just kind of throwing something together, I think that's the biggest mistake that I see. And second to that would be glaring mistakes on the resume, misspelled words, even bullet points that don't align, make the resume look unprofessional. I definitely spend a lot of time on that. Would you recommend including additional language or technical skills in the skills section on the top section of the resume? Yes, it depends on how important it is to the role, and how meaningful it is to the company. So if there's certain, if there's a position that you're looking at and it requires SaaS experience, boy, I would make sure that is front and center at the very top, because it really does matter. So I would put that at the top. One thing I forgot to mention, and this is important as well, is at the very top of the resume, if you're willing to relocate, absolutely put in willing to relocate, maybe even right next to or right below your current city. Otherwise, the person may think, oh, this person just made a mistake and they happen to apply for this position, when in fact that's not the case. You very specifically targeted that city, possibly, even though your current location happens to be somewhere else. So absolutely put that at the top. Another thing that I forgot to mention is when you're putting your contact information in a Word document, you double click at the very top and your information will go into a header. You absolutely don't want your information to go to a header, because resume scanning software will not read that. And so it will not parse that information out. So it will not take that information out and put it into their software situation, their software program properly. So do pay attention to that. Next question. I'd like to rewatch this webinar. Thank you. Where will I find it? I will connect with someone and find out how we can get a copy of this to you. Let's see. Next question. Give me just a second. I just got a reminder that if someone does make changes to your resume, especially in Word, they can redline it and make changes for you to see and decide whether you want to accept it or not. We actually get a lot of resumes that have those red lines on it, and so the person hasn't accepted it. They haven't put it in another Word document. So you see these lines through the resumes. So do make sure that you, at a minimum, accept those changes that the person recommend. Let's see. I often see requirements for certain levels of education and/or experience. How hard and fast are those? Should I even bother to apply for a job that says they require you to have at least a bachelor's? Also, experience sometimes says 3 to 5 years, but I have the skills. Doesn't that count? And so you're absolutely right. And I cannot stress this enough. that you do not need to meet every little requirement that happens to be listed. And I've seen it where sometimes even a requirement is must-have requirement. And as time goes on, the company hasn't been able to find the right person. That must-have requirement also all of a sudden becomes a lot more flexible. I would absolutely do that. One of the things that I've found to be successful that many people have used, and they'll oftentimes put this in a cover letter. And what they'll do is they make a big T. On one side, they'll put the major requirements for the position, and on the other side, they'll list how well they match up. And so they're calling attention to where they do match up, and hopefully some areas where they exceed. But they're also calling attention to the fact, yeah, I'm a little bit short of the requirements in this area, which I think is a great approach. You know, you're being very transparent, and I personally really do appreciate that. And so something like that may be a benefit. One thing I would not do is apply to every position at a company that you can find. It just doesn't look good and we see it right away when we click on a position and we click on people that have applied, then we click on someone's resume, we see the positions that that person has applied to. They've applied to 9, 10, 11, 12 positions. If nothing else, it tells me they don't have a passion about any one area. It's probably a little bit of a level of desperation there. And so I personally would recommend absolutely applying to those positions, but probably limiting it to 2 or 3 positions at each company. But again, cannot stress enough, yes, you absolutely should apply to positions, even though you don't, match every little position along the way. And I think that is all the questions that we have with a minute to spare. So one of the things that I'll reiterate is that you will receive a link to hopefully a link to this. I'm going to talk with our operations team about that. But you will receive an email with a link to our AMA questionnaire. So if you do have additional questions, please do click on that link. Let us know what the question is, and we'll be happy to answer it for you. Appreciate everyone's time today. Hope you have a great weekend. Hope you have a great Friday. Hope everyone stays safe. Thank you.